There we go. I've set up to record this so you guys know that everything you say is kept for posterity. Okay. All right. I don't know if Sophie's going to make it today or not. So we're going to just start in. I've got a whole bunch of review to do based on the homework I've seen. And the homework was good, but there's lots of little details. And that's the nature of this chapter. So I'm going to start there. And then I'm going to let you ask your questions. Then we'll do our quiz. And then we'll practice. So this is our last day on the diminished seventh chord. So after that, we go on to the next chapter. This is our last chance, the last hurrah. So let's begin. You guys can see what I've got shared on the screen, correct?
Yes.
So you see finale there, right? Okay, because I've got double shares set up and all kinds of crazy things. I don't know what's going on. And you recognize that that right there is a C major scale, correct?
Yes.
Yes, okay. And this one's a C natural minor scale. And what I've said in the past is that we have to, when we're dealing with dominants and dominant seventh chords, we have to use the harmonic minor, which is the one where we sharp the seventh. And can anyone remind me why we have to use that scale? Silence. It's echoing. Well, I will tell you why. Because the thing that gives our chord the power is this leading tone. If we're in major, there's a half step between 7 and 1. That's what creates the real power. So a dominant chord, G, B, D, that B pushes up. In a diminished seventh chord, D, F, A, F, sorry, B, D, F, A, the B is the root, is pushing up. So a lot of our power comes through the fact we have a leading tone. And if I don't have a flat here, if I have a flat here instead of a natural, there's no leading tone. There's a whole step. And so our G minor chord, the 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 D doesn't have any power. The B flat now has no power. The chord doesn't really function. And for a seventh chord, the B flat has no power. The D doesn't, then the F isn't a tritone away, so it doesn't have to resolve. There's nothing driving you to the one chord. So if we want to have a functional dominant class, that's a 5 chord or a 7 chord, we have to sharp the leading tone. We have to create that half step to get a power. Does anyone remember that? Does anyone have a question about that? Does anyone want to talk about that? Okay, get thumbs up. So that has real effect when we're looking at our 5s and 7 chords. So for example, if I'm in C major, there's a 7 chord going to 1. And remember, it's a half diminished 7. You've got this diminished chord, so you got a tritone between the F and the B. So the F wants to go down because the B wants to go up. Tritones want to resolve in contrary motion. So that F wants to go down, the B wants to go up. Then you got a 7th that wants to go down. Oh my gosh, we don't care what the D does. That automatically gives you a 1 chord. So that half diminished chord gives you a 1 chord. But what if I change this to C minor? And let's see if the chord still has any of that power. Whoops, C minor. And I'm going to hold the notes modally. Okay, so now I've added 3 flats. So the A flat still wants to go down to the G, even more than the A did. It's a 7th of a chord, it's only a half step, but you got a B flat. It doesn't have any draw to the C. You have a perfect 5th here, the B flat to F. It doesn't have any draw to anything. And so this chord doesn't have a function. The B flat doesn't have to go there. It could go anywhere else. In fact, it'll go to E flat would be its favorite chord, a movement up a 4th. So if I have a regular harmonic, a melodic minor 7 chord, I don't have a function. But what note did I change to make it harmonic minor? I took the 7th degree and I sharped it, made a B natural here, which happens to be the root of the 7th chord. 7th chord is built on the 7th degree, the leading tone. And so if I sharp the B now, what happens? Now I've got a great chord because I've got a B that wants to lead up to the C. I've got a tritone between the B and the F, so the F has to come down. I've got a 7th that wants to come down, and I've got a tritone between the D and the A flat, so the D has to go up. And look at that. It drives you to the 1 chord. So in minor, we always sharp the leading tone. In a 7 chord, that's the 7th That's the root, because the seventh degree of the scale is what we build the seventh chord on. In a 5 chord, it's the third of the chord, but that seventh degree of the scale is always sharped. And when I say always sharped, I mean if you want a chord to have function, it's sharped. If you want a chord to just be a passing chord, then you don't care. But if you want it to be a real dominant chord leading to 1, we have to sharp that seventh degree. Questions or comments, guys? Do we understand? Okay, I'll take that. Now, in the homework assignment, we had some really interesting measures. So I've brought them out here. Our first piece was in B minor. So which of these notes are in the chord? Well, the way we know this is we've been studying non-harmonic tones, right? Non-harmonic means notes not in a chord, non-harmonic, not in the harmony. And the most common are passing tones and neighbor tones. So if you see something that looks like a passing tone or a neighbor tone, you're pretty sure it's not part of the chord. But we also know that if you leap to a chord, a note, if it's dissonant, we have to return back by step in the opposite direction. It's called an appoggiatura. And if we leap away, there was Sophie's there. Hello, Sophie. And if we leap away from a chord, hello, Sophie. Glad you're with us today. Whoops, she hasn't got her audio connected yet. Hi, Sophie. Glad you're with us.
Hello.
Hello. So if we leap towards the note, we have to come back by step if it's a dissonant. If we leap away from a note, we have to return in the opposite direction. Again, if we leap away, that's called an escape tone. If we leap to a note, it's a appoggiatura. If it doesn't return by step, chances are it's a chord note. It's not a dissonance, because we don't have any other dissonances we leap to. So if you look at the first measure, that note looks a lot like a passing tone. But that note doesn't look like a dissonance. You're leaping to a note and then continuing on up. So the first chord, our chord notes, the first measure is the B, the D, and the F sharp. So that tells you the first chord's a B minor chord, which is a 1 chord. Okay, y'all got that. But the reason I bring that up is the second chord, a lot of people treated that A sharp like a dissonance, like it wasn't part of the chord. And it can't be a dissonance. We leap towards it, and it turns out we leap away. This went back up by, I think, to the D. I just didn't write it down. So we leap down and leap away. There's no treatment of dissonance. We do that. That's telling us this is a chord note. Well, if that's a chord note, what chord could it be? A sharp, C, G, C, E flat, and G is all. Sorry, I've looked the wrong key signature. Let's go back a step. It'd be A sharp, C sharp, E, and G natural. Now we're in minor. So when do we add sharps? Usually that's the leading tone, and it tells us we either have a 5 chord or a 7 chord. It's harmonic minor. And since that is the leading tone, we're in B minor. So that A sharp's the leading tone. That's a dead giveaway. A sharp, C sharp, E, and G. That's a 7/7 chord. That's all that is. I'll write it down here. So we know that that chord has no choice but to be a 7/7 chord. And in fact, in minor, it's a full diminished 7. So I'd write that with a little circle there for full diminished 7. But that's what that chord is. You don't have any choice, because both of those notes have to be in the chord. They can't be dissonances, because we leap to them and leap away. And so that tells us that's an A sharp full diminished chord. Who has a question on that? That chord befuddled many.
Yeah, that makes more sense. I was reading your comments before class started, and now I get it. Like you have the sharp, the 7th of the scale.
Yeah. And so, those comments are hopefully useful, but sometimes they're as dense as the book. So when I see something that looks like many people had the problem, and we only have 4 in the class, so many is not a big number. Then I think I better describe it too. It's probably a lot of people have this confusion. We also had a confusion of this second exercise. And so now we're in major. So there's no accidentals here, because in major, we don't have to have accidentals. So the opening, that's probably a passing note. We don't really care about the pickup notes, because we're not going to write a chord to them. But then we come to this. And this measure is really interesting, because there's 2 ways to read it. This could be an appoggiatura. We jump to it and we return by step, and then a passing tone. If that's the case, we have a B and a D in the key of D. So that's either a 6 chord, a B, D, F sharp, or it's a 4 chord, a G, B, D. And most of you put 6, and it makes a ton of sense to me, and I wouldn't change that. But there's another possibility. This could be the chord note here. That could be, those two could both be chord notes. That could be an accented passing tone. That could be a chord note. In which case, this is a C sharp, E, G, and B. In which case, this is a 7 chord in the key of D. Either one will work. Let me show you that either one will work. I'll put the chords in here. If I make this a 6 chord, 6 chord in the key of D is an A, D, right? Is a B chord, right? So it's a B minor chord. I'll just put that in here, make it simple. I won't bother to do the changes. And then it would go to maybe a 1 chord. Fine. And that will sound good. Let's listen to it. Perfectly good. But I could also say this is a 7 chord going to a 1. By the way, I put the 1 in the wrong inversion there. Sorry, guys. So I'll fix that. So this is a 7 chord. That's my chord. Going to a 1, and I'm going to fix the inversion because you don't want things in 6/4 position. Now, this works just as well, but it changes which of these chord notes are allowed. So this is just a piece of curiosity that we could do it either way. I actually prefer that one. I think that's kind of a nice chord, and I like accented passing tones because they add a little pungency. But the 6 chord works too. So this note, we don't know which ones are the chord notes here because they all will work. So you get to choose. Choice is good. But this one, you don't get to choose because in this one, you're leaping. And then it turns out you leap away. So this has to be in the chord. It can't be an appoggiatura or an escape tone because we leap in both directions. So now we got an A and a C sharp. Yeah, it could be an F sharp chord, but we're pretty sure that's a 5 chord going to a 1. So when so the thing is, how do we determine what's in the chord and what isn't? Well, we know the rules of what's acceptable for non-harmonic tones. But now we're bringing back stuff from last quarter and even the quarter before. So we're combining a lot of information here. It can be very confusing. But it gives you lots of variety and lots of choice as a composer or an arranger. You can make any of that work. So that's fun. Who's got questions on that?
So you said like from the measure with the A and C.
Yeah.
And then the measure right after is also an A and then a D.
Yes.
So you don't have to assign a chord to the first note, right? So it could be like to the second, because the first, the 1 chord would be D.
Well, 1 chord would be D, F, and A.
Yeah.
It would have all 3 of those notes. So a D and an A would certainly fit a 1 chord. Because when you're talking about a chord, we're not talking about just the root. We're talking about all the notes in the chord.
Okay.
So this chord has to have both a C sharp and an A in it. That only gives us a couple choices: an F sharp chord, which is a 3 chord, or an A chord, which is a 5 chord. This chord has to have both a D and an A in it. So that only allows us to do D, F sharp, A. That's going to be a 1 chord.
Oh, okay.
Because you have to have all the notes in the chord that are chord notes. So this measure, the question is, what are the chord notes? Is it B, C sharp, and E, or is it B and D? Both of those could be correct, but whatever one you choose, it's got to have all the chord notes in it. So when we go back to this one here, all those notes have to be in the chord, the A sharp and the G. So that has to be a 5/7. I know 7/7. That's the only chord we know that has all those notes in it.
Okay. And is there ever an instance where there's like only 1 note that makes it in the chord?
Yeah. Let me write something here arbitrarily. Okay, let's go to D major because it's easier to do examples in major. So let's imagine I'm in D major and I'm writing a chord, right? So I write this. Let's see. Okay, so we have a D here. There's a possibility with the seventh chord that the C sharp or the E could be a chord note. It's possible because it could be an E7 chord, E, G, B, D, but that's not very likely. You have an E chord, you have a neighbor tone. You have an E chord, you have a neighbor tone. D. I'm sorry, D and a neighbor tone, D and a neighbor tone, D. So there's only one note that has to be in this chord. The D has to be in this chord. And so this could be a D chord. It could be a B minor chord. It could be a G chord. Any chord that's got a D in it can be in this measure, but there's only one note because these things are just neighbor tones. So they're not in the chord. They're non-harmonic tones. All those tones we learned, the neighbor tones, the passing tones, they're called non-harmonic tones because they're not in the chord. Anything that isn't a non-harmonic tone is a harmonic tone. It is in the chord. So there's a measure where we only have one note that has to be in the chord.
Okay, that makes sense.
Are you confused, or does it actually make sense?
No, yeah, it does. For some reason, I forget to like add things that we've learned in the past. So I totally forgot about passing tones and all that.
Well, we all forget. That's why we get these assignments. You know, the book does some really dumb assignments, but they have things like this that are really good, and they're first really hard because you can't figure out. And then you say, "Oh, the teacher said we use stuff from the past." Oh, now I understand why what we learned last quarter is important to this quarter. Oh, and then we call that synthesis. It's the highest part of learning. If you ever do education theory, it's the hardest thing for students to do. It's the hardest thing for teachers to accomplish, is to actually synthesize the material so you can use it. I can give you a ton of facts and give you a test and you can check off stuff. But this exercise is our attempt to make you use it. And it's not easy. The brain doesn't want to synthesize. It really does. It's got to grow new brain cells and everything, make new connections. So yes, we have to know about passing tones and neighbor tones and all that stuff. We have to know about inversions of chords. We have to know about our 5/7 and our 7/7. We have to know about harmonic minor and sharping that bottom. Whole lot of stuff from a whole lot of different chapters all come into play in the same exercise. That it's really a mind-bogglingly tough exercise. But what's interesting is with a little practice, you suddenly find you can do it. But first time around, you're going to make mistakes. I mean, there's no question about it. There's going to be confusion all over the place. But you practice it a little bit and suddenly say, hey, I could do that. That's a year's worth of knowledge synthesized together. And now I can write arrangements. But don't be surprised that it wasn't easy first time around. Yeah, this is really hard stuff.
Okay.
Yeah. Sophie, you have a question.
Yeah, how do we differentiate between passing tones and what's supposed to be in the chord?
Well, let's look at the first measure here, right? We're in B minor. So first of all, we suspect it's a B minor chord because we often open in 1. We don't have to. But if the C sharp is not a passing tone, then what's the B? It's not clear what it is. So this looks to me like the C is just a passing tone. Our strong beats have a B, D, and F sharp, which just happens to be the notes of a B minor chord. So we're pretty sure that that's a passing tone. Now in this one, we don't know which ones are passing tones. We have to pick. If the C sharp is in the chord, this has to be a B and C sharp. It has to be a 7 chord. If the D is in the chord, then we've got a B and a D. So this is either a 6 chord or a 4 chord in the key of D major this time. But we don't know which of these is passing tones because we can have accented passing tones or unaccented. They all will work. So you get to pick, but you have to make sure your chords match the decision you made. But you don't know. There's 2 sets of chords that can work for this. And here there are no passing tones because passing tones have to be stepwise between notes. So this stuff, those things have to be chord notes because we jumped to it and jumped away from it. Jumped to it, jumped away. So those have to be chord notes. Did that answer the question? Okay. Now, just to remind you guys, one of the last things we talked about last time was this. If I go, I'll just set this computer do it right. If I go, yeah, that's a B minor chord. I made that as a B minor chord this time. Let's make it the correct chord. Let's make it a D chord. Otherwise, I'm going to wonder what I'm thinking. If I do that, I'm in root position because my D is my lowest note. It's not because it's my first note. It's because it's my lowest note. So that's a piece in first inversion, in root position. we hear that D as if it's the last whole thing. The bottom note sets are inversion. If I write it this way, and then change these two notes, we say to, now it's clearly in first inversion. My bottom note is an F. But if I instead write these chords this way, you think, oh, we start on the third of the chord. It must be in first inversion. It is not in first inversion. That D is what we hear as the root. It's the lowest note. This is still a root position chord. And the reason this gets important is when we do something like this. Let me write it in the worst possible way. If I do something like this, because now my A is my lowest note, that's a 6/4 inversion. And 6/4 inversions have this fourth, which is dissonant, and they require very special treatment. We know in the case of a cadential 1/6/4 that I can go from a 1 chord to a 1/6/4 to a 5 to a 1. That's that cadence formula. But every place else, it's really hard to work with. So the book said, avoid 6/4 chords. So how do I avoid the 6/4 chord? I put that A on the top instead of on the bottom. That's all. But don't think that that's a first inversion chord because the F sharp is the first note you hear. It's the highest note. It's not the lowest note. The bass note determines the inversion, not the first note. It's not a rhythmic thing. It's a high to low thing. Lowest note gives you the inversion. Does anyone have any questions on that one? All right. Now, there's one other thing I noticed in the homework, and let's just change. Remember this chart? That a chord progression of 3 goes to a 6 to a 4 to or a 2 to a 5 or a 7 to a 1, and the 3 can skip the 6, and the 1 can stick in between anywhere, but the basic progression has to go left to right, not right to left. Yes. Now, what happens to some of you when you were putting chords in here is you said, okay, I've got a chord that works with this measure. I have a chord that works in this measure. I have a chord that works in this measure, but it didn't work with this chart. So when you choose your chords, remember if you pick a 6 chord, even if you stick a 1 chord in between, the next measure can't have a 3 because the 3 is in this side. Once you write a 6 chord, you can't go to a 3 till you have a cadence. So once you write a 4 chord, you can't have a 6 or 3 till you have a cadence. And again, the cadence can be 5-1, and then you move on, or you go 5 back to 6, a deceptive cadence. But you have to have a cadence to get back to the 6. It's not enough to stick a 1 chord in because you can stick a 1 chord in between any chords. It's a placeholder. You have to actually have a cadence before you can go backwards. So after you've looked at the chords that are possible on these things, you have to then think, what's the next chord? Because you have to make sure your chord progression works in terms of the chart. So that's why I said you'll first write out your Roman numerals, check it against the chart, because you may find out there's a chord that doesn't work. Then you write your block chord, then you write your waltz rhythm. You see how many things from the past we have to put together to make this work? Are there questions on that? Okay, we're feeling good. So, what I would do while you're first doing this is break it into steps that each step uses only one skill. So I would first look at a measure and say, what are my chord notes and what aren't? And say, sometimes they're ambiguous like this measure, but usually they're determined. That's got to be the passing tone. There is no passing tone here. They all have to be in a chord. So figure out what's in the chord. That's your first step. That's using non-harmonic tones. Your second one is, what are then the possible chords? Remember, if these notes are in a chord, the F sharp and A, well, the F could be the bottom, or a D could be the bottom. The A can't be the bottom, the root. I'm talking about root, not inversion. So then you just come up with your Roman numerals, what are possible. Then you go back to the chart and you cross out the ones that aren't possible because they go in the wrong direction. Then you pick. Once you pick, now you write the chord notes here because that's just realizing what the Roman numerals mean. Then you write the rhythm one step at a time. Now I could do it faster than that because after 50 years, I can do 2 things at once, or even sometimes 3, but it's years and years of experience. And you get that experience. Things you'll eventually rewire, and the brain does this pretty easily, but it takes time. And so do each step one at a time, and that way you can do this very successfully. And let me repeat, why do we want to do this? Well, you're going to want to write an arrangement. Let's just say, even if you decide not to be a professional musician, your best friend's getting married. And the best friend says, could you put together a little ensemble to play my favorite pieces at my wedding? And you say, sure. And you find out you got a vocalist and an oboe player and a cellist and nothing else. So there's no music written for that. So you have to write your own arrangement, right? And it may be, the Ave Maria or maybe the latest pop tune, but whatever your best friend likes. And so now you've got to write an arrangement. Well, if you have the melody, the arrangement's not that hard to do once you've developed these skills. And you could actually do it in an hour or 2 hours for your friend and have your ensemble there and supply this music that doesn't exist anywhere. And it's a great gift to your friend. So that's why we learn these skills. This is really useful stuff. And I say, even if you don't do this for a living, your friends are going to know that you're a musician and they're going to ask for these things and you're going to want the skills to do it. But it takes some practice and it takes some time, and don't get frustrated. Just, keep plugging away. I'll keep sending you notes and eventually you'll get good at it. And then your friend will love you forever. And then they can be the godparent of your children and they can lavish gifts on them so you don't have to. And life is great. There you go. See, I'm just telling you, what happens is wonderful. All right. Now, we don't have a lot more time because that was the big stuff, but I really do want to do a quiz today because we're starting new material. And also, if you've been taking the quizzes, you'll probably have seen these questions before. And if you've learned from your past quizzes, you might do really well on it. So let's take a moment. I'm going to stop the share and we'll do some last minute review afterwards. But let's go and take today's quiz. I don't remember if it's quiz 4 or what it is, but there's a quiz today. So go ahead and give me a thumbs up when you're done. All right, who's got any questions based on the quiz? Questions, anyone? No questions based on the quiz. All right, then I'm going to show you one more thing that I touched on very briefly, because it just wasn't as important. But I think we better do it just so I don't mark you off on some paper later on. And then you say, but why, professor? You never said that. So one of the challenges in major is this is like right here, I'm in D major. So I'm in D major. I wrote here a 7/7 chord in D major. Now, the resolution of this looks pretty straight ahead. Now, again, we're not normally in root position, but it's not forbidden. So I'll just do it in root position so you can see it. The C sharp and the E, the bass, the root, and the fifth of a diminished chord is a tritone. We know that because it's a diminished chord. That's the definition. The C sharp's a leading tone. It wants to go up. Tritones like to resolve in opposite directions. So the bass is easy. The bass and tenor is going to go to this, just going to go to that. Once I tell it to, they go to this. The soprano is the seventh of the chord. It's got to go down. So I'll put the soprano going down. Whoops, went down to the wrong note, but there it goes. Now the alto, theoretically, could go to anything. It's the third of the chord. It doesn't have any draw. It could go to the F sharp or it could go to the D. But in fact, it can only go to the F sharp when you're in major. Why is that? Why is that? Someone tell me why it has to go to the F sharp and not the D. Let me show it to you going to the D and see if you can see it. Look at the soprano and alto. What is wrong with that?
They're in parallel motion.
Yeah, parallel fifths. Yeah, you got a fifth here and a fifth here. So you're allowed parallel motion, but not if they're fifths or octaves. And there's your parallel fifths. So one of the dangers with the major version of the diminished seventh chord is we can accidentally get parallel fifths between the seventh and the third of the chord. And we only worry about it. Whoops, let me put that fifth back in there. We only worry about it if they're fifths. If the E was on top of the soprano, it's a fourth. We don't care then. Anything could go any direction. But when the fifth is like this, and it's so easy to make that mistake. Now it turns out if I'm in minor, I don't have to worry about that mistake. And you're going to say, why, Santa Claus? Why? If I put this down here, let's take a look at it, where I write that fifth again. Isn't that parallel fifths even if I'm in minor? Well, let's find out. Let's change this to the key of D minor, and let's see what happens. So I'm in D major. I go to D minor. I can do that by just adding 3 flats. D minor, boom. And now let's look what happened. I still have a tritone at the bottom. Oh, I have to sharp the C minor. We have to always sharp the leading tone. Wow, look at that. I tell you to do it, and then I forget. But so we have the leading tone goes up. We have a tritone just like we did in major. So we get that sound. Then the seventh has to go down. But why is this allowed all of a sudden? What allows that? And I'm going to give you a hint so that, whoops, that was wrong. Really? Okay, I'll give you a hint. Why can we now do that with no worries? In other words, why is that not parallel fifths?
Is the first one a tritone?
Yeah, it's a tritone. Because we had to, in minor, we end up flatting the seventh to make it diminished. And when that happens, this isn't a fifth anymore, it's a tritone. And then it goes to a fifth. So we don't care about a fifth to a tritone to a fifth. That's not parallel fifths. Tritone's a different interval. So when you're in minor, you don't worry about parallel fifths at all. There are no fifths. Everything's tritones and minor thirds. But when we're in major, I go back to major. This will take me a couple of clicks. When we're in major, then that seventh is raised half a step, and now we have fifths. So we have to worry about parallel fifths when we go from 7 to 1, 7 to 1 in major. Just a little thing to add to all the other things to worry about. But if you're looking, you can see the fifths, so you can avoid them. But if you're worried, go contrary motion. Then you won't have to worry about it. That's just something that's in the book. I thought it was necessary to say it out loud and show you an example so you can't claim I never told you. I always think that learning rules of parallel fifths doesn't make sense. Just look for them. If you get to the point where you can see fifths, it's a line to a line or a space to a space. You start recognizing them. All right, that's all the time we have on this chapter because this week of prayer. You have 2 minutes for a question if anyone has a question. Otherwise, we start a new chapter on Monday. Well, guys, have a fantastic Sabbath and a great weekend. It's always a pleasure to see you. I'll see you all on Monday. Bye-bye, guys.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye-bye. You're welcome. Bye-bye.